We are the artist duo Semiconductor, and we have produced a sculpture called Cosmos. This piece of work was really inspired by being interested in the relationship between how science represents nature and how we as humans experience nature. And for this particular piece of work, we wanted to create something which works with scientific data that has been collected in the forest, and then to represent that or recontextualise it so that it becomes something new. So by taking the strings of numbers, which are the data, and then turning that into something solid, it becomes something that's tangible, something that we can experience the science in a new way. So we had a long research process where we developed the idea and how the sculpture was going to look. And a lot of this stemmed from looking at the way that the scientists document their data. So they'll have a collection of strings of numbers from different instruments that they've collected in the forest, and then they'll plot these on various representations such as graphs. And one particular graph that we were interested in was called a polar plot, which will take the yearly cycle of the forest and a year's worth of data and plot that in a circular form so that it runs from January through to December. And then for each subsequent instrument it will overlay that data. So you end up with a circular graph with many layers. And it was this technique of producing a graph like this that we then initially worked with to develop the sculpture as a spherical object.
So all the data that we collected comes as a long string of numbers, but within that are waveforms, and there are peaks when there is more water and high temperature, and troughs when it's lower. And these same forms and shapes you can see moving across the surface of the sphere, and whenever the rings of data, the waveforms radiate out, whenever they cross one another they create interference patterns, and they create these jagged lines of height and temperature, and they create this beautiful shape across the surface. All the data on the sphere was collected by the scientist Matthew Wilkinson. This experiment's been running for at least 15 years, and so all the data is in a really old format that we had to convert, and every 5 minutes of data was one piece of information, one packet of information, and we had to collect tens of thousands of files and turn them from a really old format into something we could work with to sculpt and craft with. And it took quite a lot of time to actually work out how to do this.
My name's Matt Wilkinson. I'm a research scientist at Forest Research based here at Alice Holt, and my particular research area is measuring and modelling greenhouse gas exchange, and so quantifying how much carbon dioxide forest environments are taking up and removing from the Earth's atmosphere. The reason why we've got this large tower in the middle of the forest here at this, within the Straits is to enable us to get our instrumentation up above the top of the forest canopy, which is where we need it to be to measure the CO2 exchange between the forest and the environment. So we've got a couple of instruments up there. We've got a sonic anemometer, which measures the atmospheric turbulence, how much mixing there is going on in the atmosphere. And we've also got an infrared gas analyzer, which measures the CO2 concentration in the parcels of air as they pass over the top of the forest. So this tower was built by Forest Research staff in 2009. When we're stood on the top platform, we're at about 26 metres above the top of the ground. What was really weird when we were building it, you just get this really weird sense that we were just kind of going up to the sky and we were never going to stop. Once you're above the top of the canopy, at the top of the trees, there's nothing above you, just clouds and aeroplanes. So you kind of felt like I didn't know where we were going to stop, we were just going to go on forever. Well, the UVW are the three components, three wind velocities from the sonic anemometer. So we've got the vertical component and the two horizontal components in meters per second, and then the CO2 concentration actually comes into the data log as a raw millivolt, and then we convert that to parts per million or micromoles per mole of carbon dioxide. So at the moment it's 413 parts per million at the top of the tower. There's a diurnal cycle in the CO2 uptake. At night, the forest acts as quite a strong source of CO2, and in the daytime, it acts as a strong sink, so it's removing CO2. So there's a nice diurnal cycle going on. We also see an annual cycle. So in the winter, the whole forest is acting as a source, and then during the spring, it kind of reverts back to being a sink for CO2, strong sink through the summer, and then reverts back to being a source kind of mid-November. So you've got a daily cycle, but you've also got a strong annual cycle as well.
Once we had developed the way of working with the data and working with these waveforms and then creating this sphere, we constructed a model in a 3D digital program to build the sphere and construct the surface, so that then that would become a tool for the fabricators. And then the surface pattern was taken directly from this model, and it was created by carving into the surface of the wood by a CNC cutting machine.
My name's Richard, and welcome to my CNC factory. They basically follow digits and points in virtual space. It's a very simple grid pattern they follow. It goes down to 0.002 of a millimetre. It's a standard router cutter, although an industrial router cutter. And it's just a spinning blade which travels around 30 metres a minute and cuts about 18,000 revolutions a minute. To me it sounds like a string quartet starting up or something, with all the different funny noises that keep going on. Your wood's very hard, so we've had to change our cutters to something called a solid grade carbide cutter, which is a very hard metal. We were cutting with a different cutter earlier and we didn't like it. Well, I've allowed sort of an hour for each part, but we're getting it a bit quicker because we've bunched them up, but it's still roughly an hour. 180 parts, 180 hours divided by 3, but we're doing long hours.
And then for the overall fabrication of Cosmos, we worked with a company called Millimeter.
Our process started when we got the CNC'd bit, which is basically these triangles. These clusters are made out of several triangles. So you got the pentagons made out of 5 and the hexagons made out of 6 triangles. We got them, cut them roughly out first. Then we had to find out the angles of each one, because to create the circle, the angle just has to be just exactly right before we glue it together, for it to maintain that illusion of being round. Then we glued it together. We tongue and grooved every single one onto its respective angle. After the tongue and groove, we glued the clusters together individually, every single one. So we ended up with 12 pentagons, 20 hexagons of different mappings, all numbered. Then per cluster we burned them and charcoaled them. Then we used some blackened wax to even it up, all into an even colour, because we burned it and then it had these different contrasts which took the eyes away from the information. Then we had the cluster pieces, all 32 of them, and we tongue and grooved every single one. We put the tongues into the groove and then started from the top point downwards. Inside it has slices of an orange, you could say, as ribs, so there's a certain skeleton to it, which comes almost in the center of each one of these clusters. Doing little details and touching everything up. It's ready to go.
The forest that it will be located in is called the Alice Holt Forest, and the data was collected about 1 kilometre away in a forest research forest where the Flux Tower experiment is situated. We spent quite a while deciding on where to site the sculpture. We really wanted it to be somewhere that people would come across, that wasn't necessarily very close to the entrance of the forest, but somewhere that you kind of either had to find if you were going looking for it, so it would become a bit of an adventure, or that maybe you would just come across in quite a remote part of the forest and there'd be quite an unusual object sitting there. And we had several locations in mind, but the location that we settled on was this beautiful pine glade, which has a little opening, and the sculpture sits almost in the very centre under an opening where light's coming in between the trees. And it's a very peaceful location, and also scattered all over the floor is all the debris from the surrounding forest. And because there's pine trees there, there's lots of pine cones on the floor, pine needles, there's some fallen down trees, there's uprooted trunks where you see all the root system. And so you've got these very intriguing objects already surrounding the sculpture. So Cosmos has just finished being installed, and it feels like the work is now complete. So because it's a very site-specific piece of work where we've worked with the data from the forest, so now the sculpture is in the forest, it feels like it's kind of come home, really.
We've not been able to know exactly how it's going to feel and look in the forest until this moment, and we're very pleased with the results. It seems to sit here quite comfortably and looks like it's something from space that's landed, and something that's always been here, something that's grown here. I'm quite happy to think of this as its home. I wouldn't want it anywhere else.
If you look up the definition of cosmos, it means something which is an orderly, harmonious system. And for us, we wanted to use this title to reference how all the different sources of data come to make the forest what it is.